Joining me today is Dr. Simon Baptist, Engagement Manager at Vivid Economics. He'll be speaking at IIR's Carbon Price Forum, which takes place on the 19th to 20th of July 2011 in Sydney. Simon, thanks for joining me today.
No worries, good to talk to you.
What are some of the strategies for determining the effective carbon price?
In terms of effective carbon prices, I think the first question to ask is why we need to calculate them and why we are interested in them, because how you want to calculate them is really a function of the purpose. International action now is moving away from a globally integrated system, and where the framework under Kyoto was an idea that we'll have a networked agreement of reductions, and we'll probably go about achieving those through carbon credits trading at an international level. Now that sort of picture is fading, and what we're getting is a network of different measures in different countries. And some countries are pursuing the ETS path, other countries are pursuing different ways to reduce emissions. And so now we face a world where action is very difficult to compare across countries. And there's more than one dimension in which policy can be compared. If you have something like the RET or an emissions trading scheme or simply a government directive to close down an inefficient power station, there are lots of different dimensions in which those things can be compared. You could compare cost to generators, the equivalent abatement induced by each policy, what price you'd need to induce the equivalent change in the generation mix. Many people are interested in the impact on firm competitiveness for trades that compete globally. But broadly speaking, whichever way you want to go about it, the big picture is to find a way to calculate the costs of the measure for the policy that you're interested in, and then the abatement induced by that measure. And it's relatively simple to get that measure for each individual policy, but the big question, and one which was raised again by the Productivity Commission in its report last week, was it can be quite challenging to aggregate those individual prices to get a measure for the overall economy.
What action is happening internationally, and how can we compare it across countries?
I mentioned before that the original idea behind the Kyoto Protocol was, the vision was that we'd be moving towards a system of international agreements and reductions with some form of trading to meet those targets. It's important to remember, actually, that in a lot of places there are emissions trading schemes that cover the electricity and other sectors. We have emissions trading schemes in Europe, in Norway, in New Zealand. In Australia, of course, with New South Wales GGAS scheme. In the northeast of the US, there's the RGGI scheme. There's emissions trading in Alberta, in Canada, and about to come into California and a number of other US states and Canadian provinces from 2012. A number of other countries like South Korea, Japan, South Africa and China are also all discussing it, although they don't have legislation passed yet or firm dates of implementation. So there are a lot of emissions trading scheme action happening. There's also a big push for renewables in many, many countries, especially in some of the big emerging economies like South Korea and China. And the push for renewables is not just driven by climate change concerns, but there's also concerns about energy security and, I think most importantly, a desire to become leaders in a low-carbon economy, and a view that those countries that can reduce their carbon intensity and develop these emerging technologies are going to be in a better position in the future to increase their rate of growth and to remain competitive and prosperous in a low-carbon world. As well as calculating equivalent carbon prices to compare action, you could also look at the impact in terms of the amount of emissions produced per unit of generation from an electricity perspective, or from a whole economy perspective, one could look at carbon productivity, which is the GDP produced per unit of emissions, which accounts both for energy efficiency and also the emissions associated with the production of your energy.
How successful has emissions trading been in North America and Europe?
The world has a lot of experience with emissions trading. Some of these schemes are quite old, and they're not just for carbon. There's been emissions trading schemes for sulfur dioxide in North America are some of the oldest ones. But again, it's worth remembering that emissions trading is not just happening in Europe and the US. We've had a scheme in New South Wales for a long, long time. Whether you would describe these schemes as being successful, in some ways it depends upon your perspective. In the US, their RGGI cap and trade scheme for carbon emissions in a number of states has had a very weak cap, so therefore it's had a very low price. The price is something like $2 per tonne of CO2, so that's had very little impact on the generation mix there and had very little impact in terms of reducing emissions, while the EU ETS, which has generally had a higher price and a tighter cap, has had much more of an impact in terms of changing the generation mix and reducing emissions. So there are a lot of differences in what happens depending on the scheme design, and in particular how tight the cap is. But probably if you're talking about success in terms of have electricity sectors made a successful adjustment to a world where they're subject to an ETS, Europe and the US experience, and indeed that of New South Wales, shows that there's no innate barrier to having a productive generation sector with an ETS, but the detail of the scheme is important.
What lessons can Australia learn from the UK's and Europe's approach to emissions trading and carbon pricing?
There are two recent studies in Australia that actually have looked at this exact question. So firstly, there was the report of the Productivity Commission, which came out last week, which considered emissions reduction policies in the electricity and transport sectors in a number of key economies. And secondly, Vivid Economics, along with Norton Rose, have recently produced a report for GE Australia on low carbon prosperity and what lessons we can learn from leading low carbon economies across the world. And actually both these studies have very similar lessons, which are that emissions trading and carbon pricing are very low cost ways to reduce emissions. So in countries that have an emissions trading scheme, it tends to be a much more efficient mechanism to reduce emissions than other schemes, such as feed-in tariffs or renewable energy targets. So that's a key lesson. And from the perspective of the ETS in Europe, there are also lessons to be learned from the manner in which allowances are allocated or how assistance is given to generators. And it's not just the level of assistance that is important, it's also the manner in which it is given can also have a big impact on outcomes. And the different phases of the EU ETS, where allowances have been allocated differently, phases 1, 2 and 3, really show that that question of how things are done is just as important as how much is given out.
Simon, you're speaking at IIR's Carbon Price Forum, which takes place on the 19th to 20th of July 2011 in Sydney. What will be the focus of your presentation?
So I'm hoping to give a high-level picture of what is happening across the world, what the scope of international action is, and then delve into some more detail into these questions about how can this be compared, and looking at some of the different studies that have tried to compare action and asking why we would want to compare it. And then finally moving on to, if there is asymmetric action internationally, what does this mean for Australia? What implications does this have for our electricity generation sector, and what implications does it have for our international competitiveness? And as Australia is contemplating moving towards a carbon pricing mechanism, what kind of design features might be important so that Australia can maintain its prosperity as it moves into a low carbon future?
Simon Baptist, thanks for joining us today. We look forward to your presentation in July.
Look forward to seeing you then.